Hey, A02 people. This is that promised video related to Chapter 17. I'm going to be actually really loose in this one and probably won't talk for all that long. I've been through the chapter. This is a chapter, by the way, that is not included in many intro psych textbooks. And so I actually had to go through and kind of see what they were telling you a little bit, hence my delay. As I went through it, my reaction, well, maybe I'll just kind of give you a sense of that as we go. The bigger idea here, or the thing that we're moving into is, okay, you've learned all about psychology, all these different kinds of psychology, and maybe many of you are also thinking, geez, this is kind of cool, this is kind of interesting. This is the kind of thing I would like to learn more about. I would like to study further. But then you either have this little voice in the back of your head, or you have parents in the back of your head saying, well, what the heck are you going to do with a psychology degree? How does that lead to employment? What do you do with a psychology degree? So that's the sort of big picture, and I think it's a nice way to kind of end the course, to have this discussion a little bit. And so there's kind of two ways I want to follow up on that. One is the sort of formal way that they discuss it in the textbook, but I also want to augment that with some other information that you might not know and could find valuable. So let's begin by kind of doing what they do in the chapter a little bit and just talking about some of the issues. And I'm not going to use overheads, I'm just going to talk. All right. So there is a formal field called Industrial Organizational Psychology, IO Psych. And there are graduate programs. For example, University of Waterloo has a good graduate program in this. And the specific notion of an IO degree is that you are going to now take the psychology you've learned and use it to, in some way, enhance the productivity of some business. So it's really kind of psychology is applied within a business context. And there's no doubt that a lot of people with psychology degrees are employed within business contexts with the goal of trying to help make that business function effectively. Keep in mind that once you graduate with a psychology degree, you understand people very well. And so to some extent, your degree is applicable to any position that involves people. And especially getting the best out of people. In order to do that, you have to have some understanding of them, of how they will react to various contexts, how rewards and things can come into play. A lot of the issues we've talked about throughout the course can suddenly be applied within that context. And so the textbook itself kind of highlights, when it talks about what are the sort of realms of IO psychology? What are more specifically some of the things that you would do if you became one of those kinds of psychologists? And it kind of talks about it in sort of three separate components, I guess you'd say. The first component is really with respect to hiring. So if you think of human resource departments, U of T has UTSC has a human resource department. Virtually any big corporation has a human resource department. And their task is, well, probably the most important task they play is in helping us, or whatever corporation they work for, to hire the best people for a given position. So not just a great person overall, but it's a question of fit, right? So there's certain positions that open up, and you want somebody to work and do well in that position and be happy. I'm going to kind of come back to that every now and then, because we know that satisfaction in the workplace is very much linked to productivity. If your employees are happy, they work better. If they're not happy, they don't. So a psychologist can help to make them happy. One of the things you'll learn. But let's get back to the hiring process. There's a couple of things they look for. And those of you who have been interviewed know that interview is a very stressful situation. Sometimes they look for things informally and sometimes formally. So let's just talk about the things first, and then we'll talk about the formal versus informal. Generally, of course, we want what we could just describe as competence. So anytime they're interviewing somebody, they're trying to get a sense of the person's intelligence and their ability to kind of communicate their intelligence and their ideas. So remember, peer scholar, right? One of the things I'm trying to teach you is how to think critically, how to think creatively, and how to communicate your ideas well and listen to other people well. So part of the whole interview process is the interviewer trying to gauge those things. So sometimes they'll give you like scenarios, right? Imagine you're in the following case. You're working as a team on some project, and one member of your team is not pulling their weight, social loafing, while the others are. What do you do? So they might just ask you that. What would you do if you were in that situation? So now they're kind of looking at your problem-solving skills. You know, you think about it, and you kind of come up with an idea. Well, I think I would do this. And they're interested in your sort of social judgments, I guess. You know, would you follow a course of action that would be destructive to the company morale as a whole, or can you think of ways of dealing with the situation that would maybe even lead to a positive outcome? What you'd ultimately want in a situation like that is the employee that's not pulling their weight. You would want to convince them that they should, in such a way that they actually embrace the message, and maybe that positively impacts their future. So the interviewer is seeing, can you think of ideas like that? What would you do? And whatever ideas you have, how well can you voice them to the interviewer? Because the skills you're going to use to voice that to the interviewer are the same skills you're going to use when you're interacting with the person in this context. Right? So they're asking you a lot of questions. The big picture is asking you a lot of questions to try to get at that. Kind of how smart are you? How clearly do you communicate? How good is your judgment? They're also trying to look for things like passion and real interest, real connection to the position itself. So how much, let's say I'm going to have you selling some product, and I'm hiring a salesperson. There are some people born to sell who love doing that, who really enjoy it, and then there are some people who hate doing it. Even if you're the most intelligent, articulate person in the world, if you hate what you're doing, you're probably not going to do it well. Okay, so in addition to kind of getting at competence, this person is trying to get at fit. Is the position in question a good position for you? For that, they have to get a sense of your personality. The kind of personality you want in somebody that, say, is in a back room coding a program for you. I mean, they could be very socially inept, and nobody really minds as long as they produce really good code. But versus, say, a salesman who's out interacting with your customers, that person you want to have very good social skills, right? So you have to try to get at the personality of the individual. So we've talked about these things in the course, right? Things like intelligence, language abilities, and personality. And so to some extent, and a lot of people just do it in the informal way, you can try to get at those things by just having a nice, well-structured interview where you're asking very specific questions, paying very careful attention to the answers, and just in a very human way ending up with an impression at the end about those aspects of the person. You know, how competent are they, how well do they fit, how passionate are they, that kind of thing. But some companies also do that in a much more formal way. They use tests. So, I told you throughout the course about things like IQ tests, so you guys know things like LSATs and GMATs, all that are kind of the same idea, that you can have a formal test that tries to get at somebody's problem-solving abilities, their vocabulary, whatever you think is important for the job. In some cases, they, by the way, have tests where they do things like give you an Excel spreadsheet and say, here are some raw numbers. People want the following sales figures or whatever out of this. You have 10 minutes. Go do your thing. And they're trying to get a sense of, how comfortable are you, let's say, with Excel? Do you know how to use it? Can you be effective with that? So sometimes it's a very specific, job-specific skill set, but very often they're also generally trying to measure your personality and your intelligence and your competence. So those same things we talked about informally, you could have a formal paper and pencil test where you try to get at that. We've talked, for example, about the Big Five, those 5 components of personality, and the textbook in the workplace context makes a big deal out of one of those, conscientiousness. A very important one. especially in a workplace. Conscientiousness is kind of the extent to which you really care about the quality of the work you do, and that you care about things like getting things done on time, in an appropriate manner, etc. So a conscientious employee, or student for that matter, is worth gold. That's a trait that we really want to see. No matter what their other skills, we love conscientious people. So to the extent you can measure that in a paper and pencil test, which is sometimes controversial, but that can give you a really good idea of how good this employee is going to be in a very general sense. Okay, so to recap sort of that thing, one of the things a lot of these IO people do is work in HR departments, interviewing, recruiting, and they will use a lot of what they've learned in psychology to try to find good people who fit certain positions very well. Okay, and that's one whole role. Now, let me actually mention another role, a sort of less pleasant role that often is played by IO psychologists in HR positions, and that is the termination of people, or the dealing of grievances, disputes. So if I, as a faculty member, have some problem, let's say with my chair of my department, and they and I are in violent disagreement about something, maybe I feel they're treating me unfairly or inappropriately, maybe George, my chair, is sexually harassing me. Sorry, I had to throw that in. But whatever. If I have a complaint or a grievance, where do I go? HR. So now, you have a situation of conflict resolution, really. You have two parties who are in some sort of disagreement and trying to work things out. Again, psychology comes in handy in these sort of situations, and so very often that will end up in the desk of HR, and it will be up to the human resources people to try to mediate, to try to come to some agreement about who's in the wrong and who's not, and to potentially come up with ways of dealing with that. Whether it's just putting a note in somebody's file and kind of saying, hey, don't do this anymore. In the case of sexual harassment, it could be much more serious. It could actually be criminal charges. The HR people are responsible for figuring that out. Of course, if somebody has too many complaints against them, then they may have to be terminated. Not in the Arnold Schwarzenegger way, but in the relieved from their position kind of way. And that, is very hard for somebody to lose their job. You're hitting the core of their economic ability of survival, really. So, Maslow's hierarchy, you're getting them at the security level. And so there's a lot of emotionality involved. And it's not really clinical kind of abilities, but it's getting close. You now have to somehow humanely explain to this person why they're being let go, and do your best to do it in a way that hopefully helps that person in the future with their next job. And so all of that, I think you can see where psychology could play a role, and that's just sort of in the HR department. Now, there are bigger roles as well. So now let's move to the next block. We've hired people, they're in place, they're working away. Well, an interesting question here is, how do you now give them a workplace that maximizes productivity? And while this sounds really cold, business-like, I guess, it seldom is when you get down to nuts and bolts. So for example, at a university, what would be productivity? A productive faculty member would be one that's doing a really good job teaching. So that's one of the products we hope to provide. So we hope that they're doing that conscientiously and well, high quality. We also would like them to do research, and similarly, we're hoping they're very productive there. If they're productive, that means they're getting a lot of research out, high quality research, which will tend to bring grant money in, which will tend to make them happy, etc. So usually a productive business makes everyone happy. It's kind of like a winning, soccer team or basketball team or baseball team, any team. When a team is winning, they feel very happy. And so if you have a bunch of productive employees, yes, the company's happy. It's, doing what it's supposed to be doing. But also the individuals are happy. So it often makes a lot of sense for the group collectively to think about how to enhance productivity. And let me give you one example of an extreme example I think most of you have known about, and you can do some online research if you want. But if you look at, say, how the Google offices are created, it was kind of revolutionary at the time, because rather than being a sort of formal space with individual offices and what we all think of as a corporate kind of climate, Google did things like built movie theaters, had open spaces with colorful chairs that could all be moved around, would include balls and other things in this space, a gym that people could go to, a nice restaurant with a quality cook. They created this fun, social kind of environment. So some psychologists very specifically, engineered this environment, and they engineered it with a goal in mind. At Google, they thought, our ability to survive depends upon creative ideas. So we want to inspire creative thought. And so they purposefully tried to design an environment that they thought would make people think outside the box, think a little differently. They also felt that, almost in a Pierce Color way again, that ideas develop as people discuss them and hone them and give feedback to each other. And so they also wanted this to be a relatively social area, which a lot of other businesses might think is a problem. We don't want employees talking to each other all day. Well, at Google, they kind of did. If you had a half-baked idea, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean literally, like, a half-baked cake isn't bad if you finish baking it, right? Half-baked idea, similarly, could be a good idea if it gets a little bit of input and thought and gets turned into a fully baked idea. And so the hope was that an employee who had an inkling, wow, it might be kind of cool if we did that, maybe a great thing would be for them to go talk to somebody about that. And maybe that other person would contribute a little something, and together or in a group, that idea would blossom into a much better one. So Google intentionally created a space that they hoped would foster this kind of environment. And it was also an environment, by the way, that they thought people would love, and they do by and large, and that it would attract talent. If you were, by the way, a creative person with Google type skills, when you hear about that environment, you might think, yeah, that's where I want to work. For example, you can maybe bring your dog. Some of these places, you can bring your dog to work as long as your dog's well behaved. If you're a dog owner, creative person, that's a big plus. And so things like that make it a more attractive workplace, so they're able to grab the highest quality talent, and that talent is happy when they are there. Happy employees tend to be productive employees. So sometimes within corporations, there are I/O psychologists for whom that is their main job, trying to figure out how to configure the environment to be as conducive to productivity, however that company defines productivity, as possible. It's kind of a cool job if you think about it. And sometimes they're doing experiments. They try different things, and they try to see, like, let's have a movie night. Let's see if that increases morale and makes people like each other. And if they like each other more, maybe they'll work together better. Things like that. All right. And then there is, of course, the whole notion of teamwork, group work. It's usually the case that in just about every business, there are tasks that need to be accomplished, and often those tasks are multifaceted, so that no one person has all the skill sets needed to accomplish some task. And instead, you have to draw on a number of individuals who have to learn how to work collaboratively in a very respectful and efficient, effective manner. And that can be tricky. Like, when I asked you guys who likes to do group work on assignments, and most of you guys hate it. You hate it because there's all these interpersonal dynamics involved, and there are these social loafers, and there are these keeners that want to run the show, etc. And so somehow, if a company is going to be effective, it's got to learn to manage these groups, or it's got to at least provide the resources and the structure and maybe the guidance to actually allow groups to interact in effective manners. And so that's another place where, a more specific place where an I/O psychologist might play a role. And, getting in there, working on how do we structure meetings. So for example, this is a good example, as you may have heard, there is a formal process for meetings whereby You have an agenda of items. Somebody has the floor at any given time. They do some sort of presentation while everyone listens, and then everybody interacts on it. There has been research to suggest that some of these ways of doing things lead to more efficient meetings where more gets done, more gets figured out. But there's also some interesting dynamics too, by the way. There's an interesting phenomenon by which if you have too many intelligent people in a room, it can be a problem, because intelligent people like to keep rethinking things and reanalyzing things. So too many intelligent people in a room, they can come to ideas, but sometimes they have 3 or 4 ideas that all seem kind of good to them. And then they ultimately say, okay, let's go with this direction, but then they can't stop thinking about the other directions, and they end up thinking, no, maybe we shouldn't do that, maybe we should go back to this. So often big groups of intelligent people are indecisive. And so you have to manage that. And you have to have a structure, for example, in place that maybe says, well, we have to come to a decision after 20 minutes what we're going to go with, then we decide and we go with it. And maybe, we'll come back 3 weeks later and see how things are going, and we reserve the right to change our direction, but we're at least going to do something. We're not going to be paralyzed by this cloud of thinking and thinking and thinking. There's other things, by the way, just trying to give you some psychology of that. There's something called groupthink, that sometimes groups come to bad decisions because there's this social pressure, conformity, to just kind of agree with everybody else. So there's been a lot of research now showing that a great thing for a group to have is a devil's advocate. Somebody whose role is the following. Every time some idea seems to be sort of bubbling up to the top and getting a lot of support, they try to shoot it down. They try to find all the negatives with that idea. And they ensure that the group isn't just all accepting it because of social pressure, but rather they're accepting that idea because it really has merit. So groups will focus on all the positives sometimes, and they'll convince themselves that's really great because they never really considered the negatives. So having a devil's advocate in a room can help groups reach good decisions. So again, there's a whole psychology around that tends to play very strongly in the workplace. All right, so those are kind of 3 examples: hiring, enhancing productivity, and trying to make groups function effectively, that give you a sense of how you can take psychology and apply it in a commercial context. I now want to diverge from the textbook a little bit. The textbook will tell you more about all that. But I want to give you the bigger picture, because yes, many psychologists are hired in the workplace, but they're everywhere. We're everywhere. When students come and talk to me and they say, I'm not sure if I should do a psychology degree. My parents don't think there's any jobs, or I don't know what what do you do with a bachelor's degree in psychology? Hanan, by the way, has a really good presentation on this. Keep your eye open if she usually advertises it when she does it. But the punchlines that I got early on were the following. The first surprising thing is that students that graduate with a bachelor's of psychology have the highest probability of getting a job. So their rate of employment is higher than virtually any other degree. However, what they do is extremely variable. Extremely variable. We've talked all about what an IO person might do in a business place. That's one example. But let me just throw out a few other examples. Often people with psychology degrees will go into law, or I should put that the other way. Often people who go into law have psychology degrees. Think of law. You have eyewitness testimony. That's all about memory and how memory works, and trying to set, getting people's memory out. You sometimes have children that are witnesses. Child development, like where are they cognitively? How does that factor into whether we should believe or not what they're saying? We have issues like picking a witness out of a lineup. That's sort of a perception kind of thing mixed with a memory kind of thing. Of course, we have issues of mental illness that come into the courtroom all the time. It's not rare for somebody with a mental illness to commit a crime, especially something like antisocial personality disorder. And so knowledge of clinical issues helps you. So for many lawyers, they find that, and by the way, they have to work with a team and do things, and they have to do things like evaluate witnesses, jurors, whether they want a juror there or not. So they're kind of doing a mini interview of the jurors, and then ultimately thinking, I don't want this person to be a juror on this case, or I do. So they're very often interacting with other human beings, and a lot of what you learn in psychology is of great help if you're a lawyer. It's also of great help if you're a teacher. If you're a teacher, you're interacting with students. So a lot of people would do a psych degree and then do a 1 or 2 year BEd degree, and then they go into teaching, and you want to try to motivate your students to learn. You have social issues that come up between students, so to some extent you have to be a psychologist / referee. There are formal school psychologists. There are people in schools that are specifically there to help students who are having mental challenges of some sort as they go through school. So yeah, all through the school system there's a lot of psychologists. So what do we have so far? We have the business, legal system, school system. Oh heck, why don't we throw in healthcare? If you're going to go into nursing or anything related to mental health, obviously a psychology degree does you a lot of good. You're trying to, for example, as a nurse, make a patient feel confident in the treatment they're receiving, comfortable as much as possible in general, and not terrified when they're sometimes facing terrifying situations in a strange, cold place. So, what better place for a psychology knowledge to be played out than in a hospital? Now, it's also, I want to take it even further afield. What about the person who, creates these dream vacations for couples or something, and thinks about, well, okay, this couple has a week a year when they get away, and I want to try to design something that will really make them feel rested and relaxed and invigorated. If they're the adventurous sort, maybe more energized and invigorated, but I want them to have a real mental escape from their daily realities of life. And so once again, having a good understanding of psychology, having a good understanding of people, even right from the goal of sitting down with a couple and saying, what are you looking for? Who are you? Are you partier types? Do you want to go to a place where you can party late into the evening? Or are you adventurous types where you want to be kayaking and, zip lining or whatever? And so again, there's a lot of this sort of same as the HR stuff, finding a fit between a person and an experience that those people will love. So I throw that one out there just as an aside to kind of, and let me throw you one more as an aside. Marketing. Just about every commercial you see on TV, there's a psychologist involved somewhere. What about sports psychology? There's a lot of psychologists that are helping athletes be their best. It's kind of like taking a lot of clinical things and applying them not to help someone who's having trouble to perform normally, but to take someone who's normal and have them perform extraordinarily. So I'm just kind of going across the gamut here to give you a sense that the reason we sometimes have trouble answering that question, what do you do with a psych degree, is not because there's nothing to do with a psych degree, but rather because there's so much to do with a psych degree. Some of these things require additional training. Like a teacher needs the BEd. A lawyer needs a law school to go to. Nursing, you'd go into some sort of nursing training as well there. So some of them will require some sort of top up to your bachelor's degree. Others might not. You might go right into a marketing firm with a bachelor's degree in psychology and be able to, if you're smart and you communicate well and all these peer scholar skills sneak in, you might be able to work your way up and do fantastic with your undergraduate degree. That might be all you need. So that's the bigger picture, and that's why I think when people doubt if you're thinking of a psychology degree, you should kind of think about some of these career paths. And part of the problem with psychology is it is kind of general. It's not like computer science or management where you're kind of, the goal is there and you're being trained all these skills that will help you towards that goal. In psychology, you're learning a very general idea of what are humans about, how do they work, and so that's kind of feels so big that's why it's hard to think, how would I use this? But I think as you go through your psychology degree, and as you start to get a sense of what you resonate with in psychology, what areas of psychology, is it about mental health? Is that what you like? Is it things related to memory? Is it things related to attention? Is it learning? So if it's learning, whatever. And so then eventually, hopefully you'll start to think of a career whereby you can take the stuff you really love from psychology and use it in some manner, and then you will start to get a clear idea of what you might do with a psychology degree. Maybe you want to be a prof. It's a great gig. I'm keen on the whole prof thing, so you could follow that route as well. All right, I think I made the point. So you have the sense of you've learned a lot this year. Hopefully you've tasted a lot of different kinds of psychology. Your path from here should be figuring out what parts of psychology, if you're a psych major, I should say, figuring out what parts of the psychology course you liked. And then for just about every one of them, like let's say you loved the social psychology chapter, you will see at the B level an introduction to social psychology course. So you can now take those parts you liked and that I spent 3 lectures on, and now you can take a course that's focused on that area of psychology, whatever it may be. That's our hope, that intro psych is like giving you a taste of everything, and then as you go on you start to pick those areas of psychology that you really resonate to. All right, I think I'm just about ready to shut up. Let me say again, thank you. I said a little bit of a thank you at the end of last class, but literally I think the highlight for me of most days is when I get to be in the classroom chatting with you guys. That for me is one form of therapy. Music is another form of therapy, but it's, the rest of the time I feel like I'm working, but when I get in the classroom I feel like I'm having a lot of fun. And I really appreciate you guys kind of tagging along, getting what I'm trying to do, saying nice things when you do, which I appreciate, and tolerating some of the imperfections in the course that we're continuing to try to iron out as we go. So just in a general sense, thank you. I appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to sign off for now. Bye-bye. Good luck with everything, by the way.